This is the first of 2 podcast episodes. I recorded them as one long episode, but then I split them in half or smaller in order to make them roughly 20 minutes. I know that some people really like long podcasts, but I also know other people need them to fit a bus ride or a commute. This particular episode is about cotton and genetic modification and is part of a larger conversation about sustainability and cotton. So it's one of the big questions that I get asked all the time about cotton and sustainability. It makes perfect sense because if you look around, like as I look around in my podcast studio, I'm using air quotes there, which is actually my closet, right? I have a whole shelf full of cotton items. We really enjoy cotton. A lot of people use cotton. It is a very important crop in the U.S. The U.S. is one of the global leading exporters of cotton. Here in Texas, the state where I teach, we are the nation's leading cotton producer. So thinking about cotton is a natural thing to think about if you're thinking about sustainability. But I find it useful to actually make sure that when we have a conversation about cotton and sustainability, that we've had a chance to back up and talk about some important concepts that impact the sustainability of cotton. So a big one that people have questions about or that we have to consider is about organic cotton, right? So they might see a product, it has a tag on it, it says it's organic. What does that mean for the sustainability of the product? What are you getting when you get an organic product? Why would you buy the organic product? So to think about what the organic means, we have to think about what organic isn't, okay? Organic is a contrast to what we call conventional agriculture. And in conventional agriculture, we have what we call inputs. This is like agronomy language. We have inputs that we use to create the output, which would be the crops. And conventional agriculture uses whatever inputs are going to successfully produce the output, the desired crop, the most of that crop, and the most economically efficiently for the producer, for the farmer or the rancher. And so some of the things that the farmer might be thinking about as they decide how to do their farming, inputs that they have to think about are the soil that they have, right? How high quality is it? Obviously how many acres of it they have, how much water it typically holds, so like how much the composition of the soil. There is literally a whole class called soil science. Okay, like literally a whole semester where all you do is talk about the soil. So that's like a whole big thing there. I just, would say soil, but it's big. Besides the soil as a major input, it's like the ground. When we talk about textiles, we talk about the ground, and then we have the pile or the effect on the ground. In this case, literally the ground. And then another really important input that farmers, in this case, not ranchers, farmers think about are the seeds. There are so many choices when it comes to seeds. Seeds are pretty complicated, actually, right? We think of seeds like we buy a packet at in the garden section when we're checking out at the grocery store, right? They might have a little packet of seeds there. But you might have had the experience of planting some seeds and then nothing happens, right? Well, imagine if you're a farmer and you just spent like weeks putting all the seeds out in your field and then duds. Okay. So the farmers want to have good seeds. They want to have seeds that have the right genetics that are going to produce the plants that they're after. And they're going to want to make sure that they get them at the price that they can afford. Besides the seeds, another thing that is a very common input that we just even think about it, so common, but it's the amount of water, right? So if we're planting something, like tomato seeds that we got from a tomato that we had at lunch, and then we saved the seeds and we put it in a little soil on our patio, we'd want to water it. We'd want to make sure that we kept the ground kind of moist until it germinated. We've all had the experience of overwatering something, and then it turns out we were killing it, even though we thought we were being nice to it, right? So we need the right amount of water. And then farmers in conventional agriculture also get to think about some of the different synthetic chemicals that they can add to do things like improve the soil. So they can add fertilizer, which will include nutrients that the plants need to grow that might be lacking in the soil. Phosphorus is a really common one, right? And in the olden days, farmers would get phosphorus from bone meal. Right, so we'd grind up bones after we used it to make meat or whatever. The bones would be ground up, and we could use that as a fertilizer. Now we can produce nitrogen or phosphorus or anything else using chemistry processes. And that helps the plants grow and succeed because they're getting kind of like vitamins for plants. We can also use herbicides. They are compounds that kill plants, but of course what we're looking for is herbicides that will kill weeds. We also, in the case of cotton, we use a special category of herbicide that actually will kill the leaves on the cotton plant. We call these defoliants. A super famous defoliant is Agent Orange, right? That was used to defoliate portions of the jungle during the Vietnam War, right? So we kind of understand the idea of a defoliant. And so I'll explain a bit later, but we could use defoliants as an input in growing cotton. And then, of course, especially if we live in the parts of the country in the U.S. or parts of the world where you have trouble with a pesky insect called the boll weevil, we'll probably use pesticides to tackle those and deal with insects that might be destroying our crops. All of those are acceptable inputs in conventional agriculture. And conventional agriculture is how the majority of cotton is produced. In the U.S., cotton producers are very highly developed. We have a payment system where there's kind of like a little tax on cotton that goes to research and development. I have colleagues at universities like Louisiana State who do research using the funding from these, cotton checkoffs so that they can improve the quality of the cotton. And so we have a ton of research and technology and innovation and information that goes into helping produce really high quality cotton in the U.S. One of the goals of that would be to try to figure out how to produce the cotton more efficiently, cheaper inputs for better cotton. And so efforts would always be made to reduce the amount of inputs that are used or to choose inputs that are more economically efficient. Now, in other parts of the world, producers who don't have a big, huge historical industry like we have in the U.S. or the really good genetics that we have in the U.S. from having some wonderful native cotton species here, they still end up benefiting in the long run from technology transfer. So if we develop some kind of cool new thing that we can do with cotton, then eventually the rest of the world can benefit from that. And that includes developing different kinds of herbicides and pesticides and all of the conventional things that we do. So organic agriculture was developed by a group of stakeholders, different people, food consumers, food producers, farmers, people who were concerned about the impact of some of these inputs on the environment. I know for myself, I definitely had a brush with a really dangerous pesticide that, a colleague of mine landed up in the hospital. I was fine, but it could have been more dangerous. And we had the benefit of extensive training and, labor protection here in the U.S. It's a much more serious issue in parts of the world where they don't have that. Because of these concerns about the impact of things like fertilizers that ends up in groundwater, pesticides and herbicides, that some of which are neurotoxins and can be dangerous for the workers, and obviously dangerous in the end if consumers come in contact with them, then people wanted to try to help develop a kind of agriculture that didn't need that. And unfortunately, economically, it's hard to compete with something that's cheaper because it just, can use chemicals, right? So with the organic agriculture, the stakeholders got together and came up with a set of rules that if farmers followed them and can prove that they followed them, they would get a special label that would communicate to consumers that they should be willing to pay more for the product because they were getting a product from a producer that had decided not to use something that could make their product cheaper to produce in exchange for using something that might not harm the environment. So herbicides and pesticides are not allowed in U.S. organic agriculture rules. You're not allowed to use synthetic fertilizers that are from petroleum-based, so that's most carbon synthetic chemistry right there, or fertilizers that are that use sewage. I didn't even mention that, right? Like, just spreading sewage from the sewage treatment plant on the fields, right? So those are also not allowed under organic agriculture rules. And finally, the stakeholders agreed that organic agriculture should also not allow or not provide the label to anyone that used genetically modified plants or animals. And research shows, including research that I helped to conduct, that many consumers purchase organic labeled products specifically for the purpose of avoiding genetically modified organisms. So they're not as concerned about the pesticides or herbicides. They're not as concerned about the impact on the environment. They're actually making potentially a selfish decision. They believe that they potentially might be in danger from coming in contact with genetically modified materials. So that's something that we've been able to measure out there among consumers. And so the organic label becomes a proxy for those consumers to avoid genetically modified materials. And in whole parts of the world, in fact, many cases, genetically modified food products, for example, are not allowed anyway because of these concerns that consumers have. So that's kind of the difference between organic agriculture and conventional agriculture, at least here in the U.S. So one of the things that I wanted to introduce just as a kind of an important thought exercise is what happens when we produce a standard for, in the case of cotton, to be labeled as organic in the U.S., cotton meets a standard that is actually designed for food products, right? Even though, we could eat the seed, right? So Crisco, cottonseed oil, right? We could eat the seed, but most people don't eat cotton, right? The cotton is processed extensively before it's woven or knitted, and so we can't actually do a little test with a little wipe and determine if cotton was produced with pesticides in the field or not, because they've all been washed off by the time they get to the consumer. So, then we have this question of, what's the risk or what's the damage to coming in contact with a genetically modified compound? And I'm going to pause because I'm concerned that the recording has stalled. Let me just check. Okay. No, it hasn't. What was happening is the window was getting smaller and smaller. Okay, I'm going to hit a clap, and then I can see the sort of the point at which I did the stall, and I'll find it. So I wanted to explain to you listening a little bit about genetic modification, and then we could think about what role genetic modification might play in the sustainability of cotton. Because nothing is ever as simple as just saying, no, if I don't do that, I'm being sustainable, right? If I don't drive a car, I've saved the environment. Like, it's not ever that simple. If it was simple, we would have solved it. It's actually usually pretty complicated. So let me start by explaining genetic modification in a very simple way. I might have told you at some point that my background is actually in biochemistry. That's what I studied as an undergrad. So I had to take, like a whole couple semesters of genetics and do all kinds of complicated calculations, and I didn't really enjoy it that much, but it is interesting to think about genetics. And in most cases, for a very long time, we managed the genetics of different plants and animals just using interbreeding, right? So changes to genes can basically occur in two different ways. It can occur through sexual transfer, which, if you're talking about two plants, really isn't that sexy, okay? But that's what it's called. Okay, that's a technical name, all right? And it just means that, like, somehow, this this plant shared genetic material with this plant, right? Maybe the bee took the pollen and dropped it over, and then, it went down the little stamen, right? And then, the DNA from the, the pollen was incorporated into the ovum that was created, right, to make the seed of the plant. And we know that the purpose of exchanging genetic information between plants is in order to boost natural selection, right? So if it turns out that there's one plant that is really good at something and it shares genetic information with a plant that's really good at something else, it might produce a seed, I guess a kind of baby, that is good at both of those things, right? And so we've done this for millennia, right? Back to Mendel and his sweet peas, right? Bred the different flowers together to get different colors and to make them smell better, stronger, last through the winter. Natural selection basically changes the genes of plants and animals slowly. Another way that changes to genes can occur is through mutation. And mutation very often happens because UV radiation damages genetic information, and then suddenly basically the genetic code is changed, and now the plant just literally does something different because as it's reading along, the recipe used to say, make green leaves that are, diamond shaped, and then the UV changed the recipe and now it says, make green leaves that are club shaped. Right? And it read the recipe, it does what it says, the recipe got changed. And if that plant that was mutated then had sexual transfer with the plant that hadn't, right, maybe that code was incorporated and now we have this advantage that might live on. Wow, that was just like a really short, genetics class, but this should be pretty familiar from like watching any horror movie. So genetic modification basically changes the genes more quickly than they would change through sexual transfer or mutation. With genetic modification, we basically go in and say, what if we acted as if this was a mutation that happened and we mutated this very specific portion of the genetic code and changed it to do something that we think might be useful for the plant or the animal. But in some cases, we might add genes that would not occur during natural selection. And this I can see as a source of concern for some consumers. Right, so we could take a gene from fish and put it into the tomato DNA and delay the ripening of the tomato so it can get hard, but it isn't red yet until right when it gets to the store, or maybe make it ripen, make it turn red sooner, even though it's hard. I think that's what it does. It turns red sooner, even though the tomato is hard. It's not actually a ripe tomato, but it looks ripe because it's now red. So they'll sell it in the store, and then you take a bite and you're like, bleh, right? This doesn't taste, but you're not going bleh. It tastes like a fish, right? You're just going, it's not ripe yet. The genetic information that came from the fish that delayed, or changed the color was useful for the tomato. Okay, but in some cases, they don't even use genetic information from somewhere else. They just tinker until they find a combination that works out. Genetic modification basically changes genes quickly by adding information that would not have occurred during natural selection, except by huge odds. and over a very, very long period of time. And these types of inputs are not allowed under organic agriculture, which means that people who produce organic cotton cannot use a type of cotton called BT cotton. So BT cotton, BT stands for Bacillus thuringiensis. Thuringiensis, yes. All right. Well, thuringiensis is this type of bacteria that produces a toxin that is a protein that's toxic to lepidopterans. Lepidopterans are basically butterflies and moths. And this bacteria, it basically causes the stomachs of the lepidopterans, the butterflies and moths, to explode. So if they get infected with this bacteria, the toxin is produced, boom, right? So what the scientists who produced BT cotton did is they took the little sequence for this protein, this toxic protein, and they coded it into the cotton seeds so that the cotton seeds contain a protein that kills butterflies and moths. Now, your average monarch does not stop and eat a ball of cotton, right? It's very specifically what's called the boll weevil. And it's actually not the butterfly, it's the larvae, right? So the worm, the boll weevil, right? It eats cotton, and the BT cotton actually kills the boll weevil. Now, if you or I ate that cotton, it wouldn't do anything to us. Why we would, I don't know. But if a deer came along and ate that cotton, it wouldn't do anything to them, right? It's only against the BT cotton. And that's an example of where they developed a genetic modification that dramatically reduced the amount of pesticides that they have to use to produce the cotton, because the plant itself is naturally fighting off the one main insect that preys on that cotton. Now, there are other genetic modifications, including one that makes the cotton resistant to Roundup herbicide, which could be used as a defoliant. So, not a defoliant, but to get weeds, right? So if they want to use this herbicide, they can put the Roundup herbicide and it won't damage the cotton. Although, right, some people would argue that is a different category of genetic modification because it's allowing the use of more herbicides, different than the BT cotton, which actually reduces the use of pesticides. So I just wanted to share with you that, like, they're already doing genetic modification with cotton, and BT cotton, or this other type I told you about, the Roundup herbicide cotton, would not be considered organic. So genetic modification, it sounds pretty scary. Consumers in Europe and Africa have rejected genetic modification as a acceptable input in their agricultural systems, and they don't want you to sell products that use that. There are a lot of concerns about mistakes, right? What if we destroy some kind of precious heirloom variety because we tinkered with the DNA and then sexual transfer damaged some important type of plant? What if the DNA included was somehow actually dangerous and we just didn't understand that when it was developed and we didn't test it enough to make sure that it was okay, right? And then also, it's just kind of like playing God, right? It's doing stuff in the lab. So, the scientists who work on this, they understand how much work they're doing to try and make it safe. They know how much effort they're putting into it. They know that from their perspective, their motives are good, right? They're trying to reduce the environmental damage by changing what inputs are needed. But research shows that telling consumers that they're just being silly, right, that genetic modification is fine, that doesn't actually... Believe it or not, being told that you're being silly doesn't change people's minds, okay? And actually, research has shown that the way to encourage consumers to accept genetic modifications are to demonstrate that the genetic modifications are actually safe, right? So to really trot out all of the effort that you've done to make sure that it's safe. And the genetic modification should benefit the consumer, not the farmer. So making the tomato red when it's not ripe that just means you eat an unripe tomato, right? That only benefits the farmer, who then gets to pick unripe tomatoes and send them to market sooner. Why the consumers are like, why should we accept your dangerous technology to make a tomato we don't even want, right? So coming up with genetic modifications that benefit the consumers directly. Here's one. What if we genetically modified the cotton to make it indigo blue, right? So then it would be the color everybody wanted, and it wouldn't use as much dye, right? That would be a kind that would benefit the consumer. So what I want to have you think about as we move into the next section is what kinds of genetic modifications might be valuable for increasing sustainability, might be worth the effort to convince consumers that this genetic modification is safe and that it's good to use. And one of them would be genetic modification related to water use.